All right, well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining this presentation titled Informing an Indigenous Digital Health Ecosystem Through Integration of Social Determinants of Health and Quality of Life Measures. My name's Rebecca Stewart, and I'm a master's student intern presenting on behalf of the IDHE team at Trinity Western University. As the IDHE team at Trinity Western University, led by Doctors Sawatzky and Kendra Rieger, we gratefully acknowledge that the land we live, work, play, and create on is located on the traditional, ancestral, and ceded in territory of the Stolo people. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous peoples in a spirit of reconciliation. With that spirit of reconciliation, we come to our research project. Our team at Trinity Western was approached by Mystemic Information Solutions, an Indigenous-owned and governed company, and asked to inform an Indigenous digital health ecosystem. Our team is comprised of Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers. In recognition of our positionality and best practices in working alongside Indigenous peoples, we have involved Indigenous engagement throughout the project, which I will discuss in further detail later in this presentation. Thankfully, there's an increasing recognition of the importance of integrating information about well-being into digital health systems. Incorporating this information may help empower individuals and communities to monitor their perceived well-being in a way that's culturally safe and meaningful and appropriate for them. This is particularly important for addressing health inequities experienced by Indigenous communities who have endured historical and ongoing colonization and research atrocities. So with that, we asked the following research questions. What are the relevant domains, indicators, and measures for social determinants of health and quality of life to inform culturally affirming health and social services in Indigenous communities? And what are the recommended practices for use and digital integration of this data to inform policy, investment, clinical, and service actions in Indigenous communities? Through a two-eyed seeing approach, we critically examined the experiences, priorities, and concerns of Indigenous peoples regarding their well-being by conducting a mixed method study with each component informing the other. First, we did a hermeneutic systematic review of the academic and gray literature. We chose a hermeneutic systematic review as it focuses on the process of developing understanding. Heidegger states that the interpretation of findings is grounded in a whole set of background practices, a kind of pre-understanding that makes knowing possible. And in our case, this shows seeking meaning would be impossible without an awareness of Indigenous ways of being and in knowing, guided by Indigenous voices. Within our literature review, Indigenous voice is elevated through the integration of hand-searched articles from 4 Indigenous journals that were not indexed, as well as including gray literature from Indigenous organizations. We have also been doing an interpretive, descriptive, qualitative study involving ongoing focus groups and interviews with Indigenous knowledge keepers and service providers, as well as a Delphi study, which I'll talk about later. To date, the findings have identified that social determinants of health and quality of life domains and indicators are not fully representing Indigenous views. This was exemplified through Indigenous voices in some of our qualitative findings, led by my colleague, Ayumi Sasaki. Here are some example quotes amongst much of the rich teachings and guidance that we have been receiving from our Indigenous partners. One quote says, "We have our traditional lands, and for generations, we all came there to share. We have our own traditional ways of helping one another. We have our own ways of healing." And another, "Our indicators of capturing wellness in our community is not going to be the same as the Western, right? For them, it's how many times did you go see the doctor? But for us, it's how many youths are participating in ceremonies. How many are doing naming ceremonies? How many are attending their clinics with their elders? How many are having births in the community instead of the hospital? There's a whole slew of things that we could look at." And another, "That's part of ceremony. That's part of our connection with Creator and our connection with everything on this earth and the elements. So those ceremonies are so critical. So when you're designing those tools we're talking about, how do you measure spirituality, for example?" My colleague Kathleen Lounsbury focused on the social determinants of health literature review portion of our project. As she can describe this much better than I can, I will share a short clip of her presenting at another conference that is a public video here, and she has given permission as well to share regarding her findings.
Great. So as a doctoral intern on this project, what I wanted to do was represent what I was learning from the literature review in an Indigenous way of knowing, and in my culture, my Kwakwaka'wakw culture. And so I use a Kwakwaka'wakw sun with the face at the center, because that represents that more than human relationship, that relationship that we have with the earth, the relationship that we have with the beings that are under the earth, over the earth, and upwards of the earth. And so this is really, really important to understand. And so you'll see here that I have identified different domains, but within that, before that, I have race and discrimination there, and I have colonization there, because those things radiate out and influence all the other domains. And in my reading, that was evident, like in so many different ways. And so, for instance, a domain of Indian residential schools as a social determinant of health. That is so very important to understand, that there are health consequences, there are ways in which those people and those families interact with one another because of the Indian residential school. That is a determinant of health. I want to take also a look at Indigenous sovereignty. And we are sovereign people on this land, and we walk in sovereignty. There's no question, but that isn't captured in the data. And I wanted to highlight that as something that was incredibly important as a determinant of health. How we see our lives, how we see our traditions as important to our health, how it speaks to who we are, what we are, and how we operate. Very, very important. And another thing is, another idea, I'll just talk a little about land. Land as a determinant of health. Land isn't something that is just a commodity to be traded. Land is something that is spiritual. It is transcendent. It gives. It is our first teacher. These are things that are important. It nourishes us. We nourish it. We have a relationship, a deep relationship with the land. I said I was from Alert Bay. That name actually means nothing to me. It's actually Yalis, which means the opening. That has something, that has meaning to my way of knowing and being. Alert Bay means nothing, but Yalis means something, because that calls me to my home. So very, very important. So I just want to mention this. This is just something that is a work in progress. I wanted to express who I was and my way of knowing and being as a Kwakwaka'wakw person in this process. So just
Moving on to quality of life, I have had the privilege of working on the quality of life literature review alongside Monica Friesen, who's currently on a leave. Here is a preliminary figure showing some identified Indigenous quality of life domains. As you may notice, we found overlap in the literature between Indigenous understandings and ways of viewing the determinants of health, as well as the quality of life domains. The central component of the diagram reads interconnected and interrelated. These are underlying principles found in the literature. The gray center and concentric blue rings represent a rock that is cast into a pool of water, creating a rippling outwards effect. Different sources of ripples extend and interact with each other on a body of water, just as each domain of quality of life ripples outward and interacts with the others. For the sake of time today, I will just highlight a couple of the domains that are unique in the Indigenous literature that we've been reading. First, family, kin, and community. A community and collective-oriented focus is prominent amongst family and kin, which goes beyond bloodlines, encompassing all of creation, including fellow humans, animal relatives, Mother Earth, and spiritual beings. One's being is interconnected with maintaining harmony of well-being among all, from individual to the cosmos. One quote that stood out was, "If my wanu or family are not well, I am not well." Language and culture. Cultural knowledges have their foundations in Indigenous nations' traditional lands. Traditional languages and cultures are deeply intertwined, facilitate healing from colonization, and are connected to spirituality and identity. Cultural expressions have many forms and are passed very carefully from one generation to the next. One quote is, "Elders spoke of our language as language is life. There's life in the language, and it's like good medicine. Language and culture help us through difficult times and life challenges." Which brings us to the impacts of and healing from colonization. Through oppressive and assimilative government policies and resultant sequelae, there are many layered losses, including land, identity, community, and culture. Expressions and actions of resilience and healing from the impacts of colonization are also persistent and thriving among Indigenous communities. This was exemplified in one quote here: "Our language, stories, and connection to land are essential elements for our education, resurgence, and continued survival from settler colonialism. Our creator spirit gave us the roadmap on how to live. Everything is coded in those stories." So as you can see from these domains, they're intricately connected, with each influencing another. Indigenous well-being cannot be compartmentalized, but rather must be seen from a holistic perspective. So moving into weaving the findings. As evidenced from the previous slides, initial results from the literature indicate well-being domains are not independent of one another and are grounded in underlying principles of interconnectedness, sovereignty, relationality, orality, and culture, which are impacted by the sequelae of colonization. This was affirmed by qualitative study participants who conveyed Indigenous knowledges, underscoring the need of a relational, holistic, and strength-based framework that's adaptable within each community's circumstances. In our current stage of the study, we're conducting a Delphi study based on the synthesized findings. The purpose of this Delphi is to seek consensus from knowledge keepers and service providers on areas of Indigenous health and well-being that are priorities in the Indigenous communities that they work and or live in. This is crucial, as it is only through weaving each of these interconnected findings that are found within each of our methods that progress can be made forward to creating a measurement framework. So, preliminary conclusions and recommendations. Our analysis identifies the need to further delineate the integration and application of well-being measures in digital health systems in a way that emphasizes privileging Indigenous voices for the use and governing of their own data. Much of the literature focuses on identifying domains, but has less focus on how to measure those domains. Further, there's even less focus on how that information should be utilized. As little information is available surrounding recommended practices, this leaves us to question, what should we do with these conceptual frameworks around Indigenous well-being? This literature gap and question stresses the importance of Indigenous engagement. Indigenous voice, especially through Indigenous engagement in the Learning Alliance tables and Delphi study, have been and continue to be crucial in shaping our findings. As holders of Indigenous sentient knowledge, they have helped keep the focus of the project on what Indigenous people know and believe about wellness and how that is enacted. They continue to help elevate what is most important for their peoples, ensuring we do not rely on colonial structures within academia to be the main influence of our results. As our project wraps up, one of the next phases from our research is to inform the Indigenous health ecosystem through the wellness measurement framework for health and social services in Indigenous communities in Canada. However, as clearly identified, there's not clarity on how to make that happen. Rather, at this time, we've found through the literature and qualitative portions underlying principles that must be included in these measures. They must be community-driven, including the ability for individualization within nations. They must honor Indigenous knowledges rather than Western approaches, and thus they must be culturally relevant and focused. And finally, but definitely not the least important, very important, they must be strength-based versus deficit-focused. So with that, I just want to say a special thanks to our Indigenous knowledge keepers and service providers for all of their teachings, time and space, and To note that our project in part was possible due to support from many project partners and funds from the following organizations. For more information, feel free to scan the QR code. There's a handout with some more details, and once our final results are available, you can find them at the website here, healthyqol.com. Please feel free to contact any of us as well. Thank you.